Okay. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of NASA Land Cover and Land Use Change Program, I welcome you all to the LC Luck Forestry Hotspots webinar series. My name is Melanie Reynolds, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. This is the fourth webinar of the series featuring NASA LC Luck projects focused on forestry hotspots of land cover and land use change. Before we begin today's webinar, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping measures. Today's webinar will be recorded and it will be available online via our website. A question and answer session will be held after the presentation. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please send them, share them with me in the chat box in the lower right-hand side of your screen. We highly encourage your active participation throughout the session. In case of any technical difficulties, please use the chat window to directly interact with me. Please note that we'll have all participants on mute to avoid background noise and any interruptions. There is a wealth of information available at our website, lcluck.umd.edu, about our past and present projects, science team meetings, previous webinars, and a variety of land cover metadata generated through our projects. We invite you to visit our website to know more about our program. Presenting today is Dr. Christoph Nolte. Dr. Nolte is an assistant professor at Boston University in the Department of Earth and Environment. He has an International Master's of Science in Rural Development and a PhD in Natural Resources and Environment from the University of Michigan. Dr. Nolte is primarily interested in assessing the emergence and effectiveness of different land conservation interventions using large data sets and satellite imagery. His work currently focuses on private land protection in the USA, Colombia, and Chile. Today, Dr. Nolte is presenting Comparing the Effectiveness of Conservation Instruments in the Colombian Andes Biodiversity Hotspot. All right, you can take it away.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, Melanie. Hello, everyone. I'm Christoph. I am presenting this as part of a larger team. Paulo Arevalo and Eric Bullock are our remote sensing experts on this project. They were both trained at the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University with Curtis Woodcock, Mark Friedland, Pontus Olofsson. You might know some of them. And with Anna Reboredo Segovia, who is a PhD student in Earth and Environment, trained as a tropical ecologist, and now using cutting-edge impact evaluation methods. And I'm really happy that Eric and Anna were both happy to jump in and present their share of the work, because it's really a teamwork. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to situate us a little bit. I'm going to motivate the work and put it in context and then essentially present like our proposal idea. And then I will leave the stage to Eric and Anna to present their pieces of the work. So as Melanie mentioned, I'm interested in the effectiveness and emergence of conservation interventions. And when, especially biodiversity, species conservation actions are at the center. Of course, we conserve land for many other reasons, which are also of interest. But when we think about species and the global mass extinction that we find ourselves in, many people think, in South America at least, about the Amazon. The Amazon is a highly species-rich landscape, as you see here. What you see in colors here are species richness maps of vertebrates. But when we actually look at where the threatened species are, the maps look very, very different. And our project focuses on the region that is highlighted in the maps of particularly high richness of threatened species. The Andes region, and specifically the Colombian Andes region. Now, for biodiversity, this is a really interesting and crucial location, and what happens in this region will play a major role in the fate of those species. The Colombian Andes are very rich in threatened and endemic species, as you've just seen. They're also home to the majority of the Colombian population and economic activity. Many of the forest habitats that are in that area are smaller, fragmented. We have many small range species in that area. And the landscape is highly dynamic. We see spatial shifts in the intensity of civil conflict. The peace process that varies a little bit over time, but is expected to affect future land use. We see those changes already. Climate change is expected to shift and contract many species ranges. And some of the we have added to the Colombian Andes 2 areas that we're also focusing on. One is the Sierra Nevada Santa Marta, formerly not part of the Andes, but also large mountain range and the most irreplaceable park for threatened species, according to an article in Science. And we have also expanded a little bit the area to include the Caribbean lowlands, because we also began to map one of the most critically endangered ecosystems, tropical dry forest. Now, in addition to its relevance for biodiversity, Colombia is also a really fascinating location to study conservation interventions. And that is because, see, it's not right. Let's see, oh, there you go. That's because we see a lot of public land protection. So what you see here in green are existing large protected areas. We don't expect that there will be large additions to those, precisely because we are in a location with a large population. But Colombia has a very unique land acquisition program. Since 1993, there's a law on the books that requires local governments to spend 1% of their current income on land purchase for conservation. Originally, mostly for watershed protection, increasingly also for conservation, and that's really the longest running program in the tropics, to the best of my knowledge. Over the last 5 or 6 years or so, added to that were payments for environmental services, programs that do not acquire land, but that are temporary contracts, and that are also used for carbon offsets. So we have both active investments into conservation and interest in conserving more land, ideally through voluntary land protection measures for threatened species. Here is a map that is currently in review for where those spatial priorities for birds could be. But at the same time, costs of those projects are not low. Public budgets are constrained, and in some locations, especially the red areas here where you have the large cities and population centers, costs are high. So the question that is on people's mind is which of those programs will add the most forest habitat per peso? Now, that's an extreme version of that question. Of course, there are other outcomes that are interesting and important of those programs, but for simplicity, I'll put that at the center of this presentation. So this work, so when we started writing this grant, proposing this grant, Anna had already done pretty enormous work in compiling the first spatial database of public land acquisitions in Colombia, what you see here in pink and currently also under review. So we were thinking, well, why don't we could study the effects of those public land acquisitions and payments for environmental services on forest habitat in the Andes. This might help us answer questions such as, does one tend to be more cost effective than the other? Right? And this is really interesting because it might be the only tropical location, at least it's the only one I'm aware of, that has large public investments into both interventions in the same landscape. So we could attempt a rigorous impact evaluation, but we would need wall-to-wall time series of forest habitat change. And that is the remote sensing problem, right? So there are a few characteristics of the remote sensing problem that are worth mentioning. One is that the patches of change in the Andes are usually small. This is not this massive large-scale Amazon deforestation or palm oil conversion in Indonesia. We're talking about small patches that are, however, relevant. Those small patches are relevant. We're looking at a long time period, and we would like to see change. We would like to be able to track change in multiple classes, because forests have different value to species, whether they're stable, regrown, whether it's a dry forest ecosystem, whether it's a plantation. And all of that happens in the context of a particularly complicating remote sensing challenge, which is it's a very cloudy landscape, and it's a very steep landscape in parts. And if you know about remote sensing, those are two major challenges that make all of this very complicated. So nevertheless, we said, okay, let's put a dream team together, and we wrote this grant as a team. Our partners in Colombia are the Institute of Hydrology, Meteorology, and Environmental Studies, IDEAM, the Alexander von Humboldt Biological Resources Research Institute, and the Javeriana University. So the grant has two main goals. One is to develop the first temporarily consistent map of 25-year forest habitat change in the Colombian Andes that discriminates between forest types of different habitat value to species. and then estimate and compare the relative cost effectiveness of Colombia's principal public conservation strategies in protecting and restoring forest habitat in the Colombian Andes. So land acquisitions, permanent land transactions of all rights, and payments for environment services, permanent transactions of partial rights. And with that, I'll pass it on to Eric. Eric.
Thanks, Christoph. Hi, everyone. So Eric Bullock here, was at Boston University, now at the U.S. Forest Service in Utah. And along with my colleague, Paul Aravallo, I've been leading the remote sensing component of this project. And so, our primary goal, as Christoph said, is to create a long record of forest change with a variety of drivers and classes and with high spatial and temporal accuracy. And I'll just let you click through these. And we really need information continuously through time. We need the temporal accuracy to be able to compare to the dates of the land acquisition. And really the only way that we're able to create this data set, the only source of information, as you're probably aware, is Landsats, the only freely available data source with the temporal archive that is necessary for doing this evaluation. As Christoph noted, remote sensing is problematic everywhere, but it's especially challenging here, due in large part to the real long history of complex land use dynamics and also the environmental features. So we tested a few different approaches to classifying forest cover change. And basically, to summarize, we applied a few different Landsat-based time series approaches. We evaluated global data sets, and we did an accuracy assessment and concluded that none of them were able to give us the precision and accuracy that we need in order to effectively evaluate these land acquisitions. And so we decided, instead of relying on a single approach to classification and change detection, to use a two-part hierarchical approach, which I think actually explains better in the next slide. So there's really two main components of the remote sensing part of the project. And because we decided that no single approach was appropriate for mapping the land cover change at the granularity that we really need, we instead deployed an ensemble approach to classification. And so this is something that you may be familiar with. It's rooted in machine learning. And it was demonstrated by my current supervisor in the remote sensing context, Sean Healy, who's also a team member here. That is an ensemble approach to classification. We're basically taking the results and metrics from different time series algorithms, different remote sensing metrics and global data sets, and stacking them all together into one image and using an ancillary training data set on land cover change to directly classify the timing and location of forest cover change. So instead of trying to use a single algorithm itself, we're basically letting the classifier choose between the different algorithms and determine when and where precisely there is forest cover change. And that's just to get this data set of forest cover change through time. Not at the level of detail we really need, but that's just the first step. So then the second step is actually distinguishing between these different types of forests and land cover that have very specific features that we're able to use to develop class-specific methodologies, and they also have different conservation values. So I'll get into a little bit of that later. So the ensemble approach, as I said before, it's applying a couple of different change detection algorithms deriving the different metrics from those algorithms, and then doing a secondary classification to classify land cover change. And what you get out of that are probabilities of, on a yearly basis, of forest, non-forest, loss, and gain. But essentially what this is doing is getting us yearly forest, non-forest maps. It sounds somewhat complicated and there's a lot of inputs that go into it, but in the end of the day, what we get out of this whole process is yearly forest, non-forest maps that we have found to be consistently more accurate, both in the timing and location of forest cover change, than any of our original attempts at doing this using a single approach. So once we have these yearly maps of forest cover change, or forest and non-forest, then that's where the second part of the process comes in. And so that's where we're distinguishing between, for forests, these very specific types of forests that have different conservation values, and then also for non-forests, different land cover classifications. And so for each of the different forest types, we've developed specific methodologies based off of our knowledge of that ecosystem, and apply that to distinguish classes such as dry forests, secondary forests, mature plantations, oil palms, various different classes, and each of those have their own specific methodology that I won't really get into each of them here. But the point is, the overall point here is that, the ensemble model is used to get accurate maps of forest, not forest, through time. And then we use our knowledge of these specific classes to develop and deploy specific methodologies for further delineating between the different classes. And it should note that the accuracy assessment of this is still ongoing, but preliminary results look pretty good. So to give just one example of what I mean by distinguishing with further detail of real important forest type classes, dry forests in Colombia are one of the most critically threatened and ecologically sensitive ecosystems in the world. And so there's a lot of interest in being able to map them, and also map changes through time in dry forests. And to do that, we identified a set of variables to define a climate envelope of where there could potentially be dry forests. And we use that information in order to develop a training data set and classify where these dry forests are. And as you can see here on the right, this is just an example of this climate envelope that's just based off of where potentially could these forests be. And so once we have that training data set, we apply it to the CCDC algorithm. I'm sure that that's been presented to this team before. It's a Landsat time series change detection algorithm that uses regression analysis to model spectral change through time, and then training data to classify to produce classifications based off of the model parameters. And so based off the training data that we developed from the climate envelope for the dry forest, we classify these CCDC parameters in order to get maps of dry forest, basically. And so one primary advantage of this is that the CCDC regression it's a harmonic regression that is able to capture seasonality throughout the year. And that is one very distinguishing feature of dry forest in Colombia. Not all of them, that's a huge generalization, but in a very best case scenario, you'll see what is shown in the map on the left here. That's on the bottom, that's a plot showing tassel cap greenness over on the x-axis is the day of year. And you can see that there's clear patterns of phenology or seasonality in these forests. And we're able to capture that in these regression models and use that to distinguish these dry forests from other types of forests. And basically, just to summarize, we use the climate envelope to extract training data, and then we use CCDC to develop the spectral temporal metrics that are used for classifying the probability of dry forest throughout our entire study area. And this is just one example of how we use information about these very detailed classes to define a class-specific methodology to further delineate between forest and non-forest. And this is all still ongoing. So we have a preliminary product, but yeah, that's where we are at the moment with the remote sensing part of the project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. That was a great summary. We'll take questions at the end, and I'll move forward to our second presenter, who is going to share with us some insights on our second goal, Anna Reboredo Segovia, who is a PhD student here, as I mentioned, tropical ecologist, and now well-trained in rigorous impact evaluation methods. And she's gonna share with us her first insights on estimating and comparing the relative cost effectiveness of Colombia's land acquisitions and payments for environmental services in one study region. Anna, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Happy to join you from Medellin, Colombia. I'm going to get us started with a geographical representation of where these interventions are happening. So hopefully you can see on this map, we have our land acquisitions in blue and our payments for ecosystem services in fuchsia. And you can already start to see that the PES parcels are much more numerous. They're much larger in extent, cover a much larger area, even though our land acquisitions started much longer ago, some dating back to 1955. And if you know anything about the geography of this region, the areas to the east of this map are closer to Medellin. They are in wealthier and higher altitude areas that were developed longer ago. And this is where the land acquisitions tend to be concentrated, whereas the payments for ecosystem services have been more distributed and therefore are more in lower elevations in places with higher deforestation pressure. So just from looking at this map, we would kind of expect that we would see more of an impact from payments for ecosystem services because they're in areas with higher deforestation pressure and they also have a larger extent. And I forgot to mention also, you can also see that a lot of these interventions are overlapping with protected areas. And that's something that we actually control for in this study rather than trying to understand the impacts of the protected areas separately. So, okay, so to understand the causal impacts of these interventions, we combine matching plus difference in differences. And this combination of methods generates results that are most similar to experimental methods, although we are using observational data. And for an example of this, you can see for our Miranda 2017. And matching serves to prune any untreated parcels and basically generates a sample that has distribution of variables that's very similar to our treated group. So this allows us to control for observable differences, such as initial forest cover area, the percent deforestation in a nearby radius, travel time to cities, elevation, slope, etc. Anything that would bias the outcome towards one of these groups, we want to eliminate, so that the only thing that is different is that they receive the treatment. So first we do this matching, and that hopefully generates a counterfactual. What counterfactual group that shows what would have happened in the absence of the treatment. And then we run difference in differences, which is meant to give us our parameter of interest, which is the average treatment effect on the treated. So what is the effect of treatment on the parcels that are treated? And normally, if we have just 2 time periods where the treatment is applied in 1 year and we have just before and after, then we can run panel regressions with 2-way fixed effects, and this will yield difference in differences. But Goodman et al. In 2019 showed that this is not applicable for when you have treatments that are staggered over time. So if you have some groups that entered treatment in 2013, others that entered 2014, et cetera, because then in the panel regression, you are comparing possibly just treated groups with groups that have been treated for a longer time, and that's not a valid comparison. So Callaway and Santana in 2021 developed a method to estimate annual impacts on any outcome with treatments that happen over multiple time periods. And this still uses the same difference in differences approach with panel regressions that controls for time invariant unobservable differences through the 2-way fixed effects. And another benefit of this approach is that you can compare places that have been treated with places that have never been treated, or you can also compare them with places that have not yet been treated. And through these 2 methods, we are able to estimate the outcome, which in this case is the percent forest cover, and we have this outcome from 2005 to 2018. So going to some first results, these graphs show the average treatment effect on the treated forest cover at the parcel level, and the left side of the graph shows the results for land acquisitions, and each one of these points shows a cohort year. So the group that was treated in the year on the x-axis. And you can see that there are significant effects where the confidence interval does not overlap with 0 for several cohort years in the land acquisitions group. But for the payments for environmental services, we don't see any significant impact so far. And the method proposed by Callaway and Santana also allows us to see the evolution of these average treatment effects with a length of exposure. So you can see in the blue pre-treatment effects, which should be 0 if we do our matching correctly, and the post-treatment effects. And as these groups in the land acquisitions group have a longer time to be treated, we start to see significant effects. And we see kind of a similar trend with the payments for ecosystem services, but they never actually become significant. So we're seeing that the temporal duration of the treatment has like an outsized influence on the significance of the effects. And that leads us to an open question, which is, we can see in the acquired parcels that it takes 8 years for land acquisitions to have an impact. What difference will a program such as payments for ecosystem services, where you can drop out at any time, make? And shouldn't we be seeing impacts within 1 year? And this leads us to several conclusions about these programs. Both could benefit from better targeting. Even though these land acquisitions do have some impacts, they still result in very small results for forest cover. And yes, these programs could benefit a lot from targeting places that have high deforestation pressure and would be deforested if they did not receive treatment. And I'll turn it back to you, Christoph.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna. That was excellent. All right, so I'm going to wrap us up. So what did we learn from mostly on the remote sensing side, because it's a remote sensing audience? Well, forest change detection in cloudy mountainous landscape, as Eric already mentioned, we found that no single change detection algorithm was sufficient. Our ensemble model, while the accuracy assessment is still ongoing, it seems to improve spatial and temporal accuracy in detecting forest loss and gain. Tracking regrowth, deforestation, which of course is a goal for forest conservation in the Andes, remains difficult. But also, on the other hand, we are really happy how the seasonality features help us detect change in the extent of dry forests. What's next for us? Test a wider suite of topographic correction methods, or include even the illumination and topographic conditions directly in the classifier. Filling in gaps in extremely cloudy areas with radar. Of course, complete the accuracy assessments, and then perhaps expand to full Andes and include other forest characteristics such as height, biomass, and biodiversity. And then our hope is that with those remote sensing products, we can track long-term impacts of land protection actions that are as small as, the parcel level protection actions that you have seen. All right, with that, thank you very much. And please let us know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was really great. If anyone has any questions, please send them in the chat box and I will read them out. Looks like you guys covered everything. We don't have any questions yet.
Perfect research. No questions left. No, good question. Good research creates more questions, at least to me.
All right, it looks like someone said they have 2 questions, but to give them a moment because they're typing them out. All right, so we have a first question that says, I noticed you worked with the IDEAM Institute. Did you consider using the national official data set for forest or non-forest layers in Colombia?
Eric, do you want to take this?
Otherwise, I can try. Yeah, the basic answer is yes, we did evaluate that and are trying to improve upon that. I'm not as much involved in that as partner Paulo, so I can't provide more detail. But we are working closely with them with all of the data sets they have, including their forest maps. But I can't give any more detail than that.
Yeah, our plan at this point is, so we will go to Colombia in January and we'll meet with the partners and share the data sets and discuss and compare. But at this point, yeah, the forest data sets are not part of the classifier itself.
Awesome, thank you. You have another question that says, how do you expect to use the SAR data to fill in the gaps?
Good question. So we're not going to be able to recreate what we're doing over 25 years with SAR data. There's just not that data available to us. What we're hoping is to get to a lower tier of classification when there is data, basically applying AOLIS PAL-SAR and the same training data we have to the years that we have data available with radar. So whether or not we're going to be able to get the same detail in terms of forest type classification is unclear. And we also know that we won't be able to get the same temporal detail. But essentially what we're going to do is just, areas, there's a lot of areas where there's no optical data or very little, and apply the same approach to the best of our ability with the same training data and see what we're able to obtain from that. I should add that in recent years, Sentinel-1 C-band radar data has been proven to be applicable for time series analysis. I led a paper using CCDC to actually do that exactly. The problem there is that only goes back to 2014 or so. And so we're not able to use that to compare it to a lot of the land acquisitions that occurred previously.
Okay, thank you. The next question says, how are you conducting your error assessment of the forest change maps?
So in two ways, we collected a data set that has yearly labels of forest and non-forest. And so that we're able to, on a yearly basis, get the correspondence with the map of, okay, let me try and rephrase this. We collected a design sample of forest cover change, and we split the sample in half, and we're using some of that for training and some of that for classifying. And we're treating it as a cluster sample where every year's accuracy goes into the contribution of that sample to the overall accuracy of the map, if that makes sense. But basically, we collected this data set and we split it in half, and we're using half of it for the accuracy assessment. And I should add that we are not done collecting a similar data set for the individual forest types. That's ongoing.
Awesome, thank you. The next question says, are there any known biases in the geographic context of sitting the land acquisitions versus the payment for ecosystem services locations?
Sorry, could you repeat that? If that was a question that I might address, I was busy copying questions in the chat.
Yeah, no worries. It says, are there any known biases in the geographic context of sitting the land acquisitions versus the payment for ecosystem service locations?
Yeah, I believe Anna has briefly addressed that, so yeah, I'll let her.
Yeah, sorry, the ecological conditions, right?
They asked about the geographic context of land acquisitions.
Yeah, so one thing that was outstanding was that land acquisitions tend to be in higher elevations. And this is mostly because higher elevation areas also are the areas that have more income and can afford the higher upfront costs of land acquisitions. But it also means that that land acquisitions are under less deforestation pressure than payments for ecosystem services. So yes, they are in areas that are geographically biased in that way, but not really in any other way that I looked at. And as far as like the ecosystems that they cover, they are fairly similar as well.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Nolte, it looks like you got two questions directly. If you want to read those out and address those, you can do that.
Sure. So one question I received was whether the data will be made available, and the answer to that is yes. So that is part of our strategy. I think we wanna put the first data set, the remote sensing data set, out by January, by the time that we go to Colombia and work with our partners. So yes, of course, there will be published data sets. And then the other question is, I'm wondering how the seasonality of El Nino is being accounted for in the model. And I think not really formally. I assume this is about changes to the seasonality that we get every few years. I don't think we have incorporated that yet, but Eric, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I could add to both those comments. In terms of El Nino, we're not accounting for that. And that could be problematic, and we really have not addressed that yet, to be honest. In terms of data availability, we're fully intending on officially releasing the data set when we have it finalized. If anyone wants the preliminary data set that we have now, please let me know. I'd be happy to share a link to an Earth Engine asset, because we do want to collect feedback on it. It's just not finalized yet, so we're not going to host it anywhere until we'll get to that point.
And then there was one more question, whether we have considered any DL, I assume that means deep learning approaches, using national data sets as true labels. I guess the answer is we're not really doing deep learning, and I'm not sure what the last part, national data sets, refers to, but if you want to try for a stab at that question, Eric.
My interpretation of the national data set is being true labels as, what EDM or other agencies have collected, either in the field. And the answer to that is, I don't know. And I believe not, but, and the answer in terms of deep learning, yes, we've discussed it. And no, we have not tried to implement it. We've been working primarily in the spatial domain. My understanding of a lot of the advantages these deep learning approaches is, it takes advantage of spatial patterns, and that's not something that at least I am an expert in, and so we have not tested that yet. But I would love to hear suggestions or whatnot.
Okay, thank you. The next question says, one of the most difficult challenges for land cover mapping is the collection of reliable ground data for calibration and testing. Can you please expand a bit on how such data was collected and whether how your experience can help optimizing such time-demanding effort?
So, as Christoph noted, we haven't actually been to collect field observations yet, but that will occur in January. In terms of the data set we are using to assess the forest cover change maps, that we generated a tool on Google Earth Engine that allows you to, it's basically like time sync if anyone has ever used that before. It allows you to see Landsat data, planet, all other data that you want, and assign yearly labels to individual sample units and save that as an asset. And that's an imperfect process, and obviously it'd be a lot better to go to the field, especially for something like dry forest that we really can't distinguish just using satellite data, like through that type of interpretation. So that's an unresolved topic that we're hoping to our trip to Colombia in January will help with that.
Great, thank you. The next question says, could you please share how you ensured there were no selection bias after matching treatments and controls?
Well,
I would like to try. Go ahead now.
Yeah. We can't really ensure that there are zero selection biases because there are some things that are unobserved. For example, things like the life stage of the family that owns the parcel or is receiving the payments, that could have an impact. Hopefully with large enough numbers, we're getting an even distribution amongst those two groups, but those are things that we can observe. With things that we can observe, we know that parcels are selected based on forest cover, based on their proximity to water sources, and based on the income of families and things like that. And those are things that we were able to address through matching, but we can't ever say that we could eliminate all sources of potential selection bias.
Thank you.
Yeah, just more general, this is a general problem with this method. To really take out worries about selection bias, you would have to run a randomized controlled trial, and that is just not happening in most of those intervention types. So we will always have to live with assumptions around having been able to control for selection bias or not.
Thank you. The next question says, I'm curious to know whether you have assessed to what extent temporal data gaps influence classification accuracy with the CCDC. That is specifically critically in earlier years when data availability is very constrained.
Yes. So the short answer is yes. The temporal accuracy of CCDC and everything else that we tested was very bad in our initial accuracy assessment. And that's essentially important here because the timing really matters because we're trying to compare land acquisition. So in terms of the earlier years, it's less important to be as precise, and the data is less precise because that's when less of the land acquisition occurred than in the middle 2000s. But the short answer is it's a really challenging problem, especially when there are data gaps. We are quantifying that by using this cluster assessment approach where every year's accuracy for an individual sample unit is contributing to the overall assessment of accuracy of the change maps. So if it's not identifying change for a specific year, that is being treated as an omission error, even if it identifies that change later on. So it's a hard problem, and it's going to lead to, there's just periods where there's no data. And we are hoping to fill in some of those gaps with radar data, but there's only so much that we could do with the data we have available.
There was one more direct message I received in the chat. Have you all connected with Map Biomas? They're doing very similar work in Brazil in temporal analysis of land cover change. I guess the short answer is that we have no formal relationship with them, but there is certainly a lot of cross-fertilization. Perhaps Eric wants to talk about Carlos Souza's inspiration for your own coded or similar.
Yeah, so as Christoph noted, officially no. Dr. Carlos Souza was on my PhD committee, and he really was a big part of the inspiration for a lot of the remote sensing work that I've done, and he's one of the founders of Map Biomas. They have an enormous data set that they've collected in the Brazilian Amazon on land cover and land cover change, and they have their own process. We are not applying that. I've used that elsewhere, but we're not using that for this project, but we are perfectly aware of it. And they're doing tremendous work. I mean, they have very similar objectives, and they're very open about sharing their data and methods and everything.
Thank you. You have another question that says, will you be using SAR backscatter or interferometric approaches?
Well, we have been planning on using backscatter. I just found out that the PalSAR-2 INSAR data is now available for freely through the ASF. I have not used that before, so I don't know how much we're going to be using it. I have only experience in using backscatter in the form of imagery. So that's where we're going to start and see what we could do from there. But we're going to start by just classification of backscatter imagery.
Okay, thank you.
I would love it if there were Sentinel-1 coherence imagery available easily online. But as of now, that's not something that we have access to and have experience with.
Okay, thank you. As we approach the hour, I think we're going to bring the session to a close. If you have any more questions about this, you can forward them to me. I'm going to send my email in the chat box. That should have gone out to everyone. So on behalf of NASA Land Cover and Land Use Change Program, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Nolte, and his colleagues for their time and informative presentation. I would like to thank all of our participants for attending the webinar, and we hope that you find the information presented here to be useful and valuable. We encourage our participants to send us comments and suggestions about this webinar and any future webinars. A link to today's webinar session will be posted on our website. This will be useful to review any material you may have missed or would like to go over again. Thank you, Dr. Nolte, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.